Jackson Park had been on Outpost Meridian for exactly 3 days when Commander Sarah Chen called him into a private briefing and destroyed any illusion that this assignment would be routine. "Your first assignment," she said without preamble, "is to spend tonight in Queen Lishara's presence chamber. No guards, no weapons, no electronic devices. Just you and the Etherian Queen from sunset to dawn." Jackson's brain performed a complete stop and restart sequence. "I'm sorry, what?" Chen pulled up data on her tablet, her expression suggesting she was as surprised by this turn of events as Jackson was about to be. "The Etherian ritual of Kelthara," she explained. "It's how their species evaluates trustworthiness for diplomatic partnerships. Queen Lishara enters a vulnerable biocycle during night hours, lowered physical defenses, heightened empathic sensitivity. If she's going to work with someone, she needs to confirm through direct experience that they won't exploit that vulnerability." Jackson sat down carefully in the chair across from Chen's desk, trying to process this information. "And she wants me, a human, to sit in a room with her while she's vulnerable. She specifically requested you by name." Chen's tone suggested she'd already had this conversation with herself several times and hadn't arrived at satisfying answers. "We're not entirely sure why. Her reasoning was somewhat opaque even by Etherian standards, but the request was unmistakable." Jackson had arrived at Outpost Meridian 3 days ago with low expectations and even lower enthusiasm. The outpost was new, barely 2 months operational, perched at the edge of contested space, where Terran-controlled systems met the borders of the Etherian sovereignty. It was technically a diplomatic facility, designed to facilitate communication between powers who didn't quite trust each other enough for formal embassy relationships, but recognized that complete isolation was dangerous. In practice, it was a career dead end. Senior officers didn't get assigned to Outpost Meridian. Promising diplomatic talent didn't request postings here. You ended up at places like this when you'd made someone important uncomfortable but not quite angry enough to end your career entirely. Jackson's transfer had come with the official designation, opportunity for professional development in cross-species relations, which he understood meant, "We're putting you somewhere you can't cause more problems while we figure out what to do with you." His last assignment had ended with what the reports called a disagreement with superior officers regarding appropriate use of force during civilian evacuation operations, which was bureaucratic language for he refused to follow orders that would have gotten refugees killed and made his commanding officer look bad in front of the brass. The evacuation had succeeded. All 300 refugees had made it out of the war zone alive, including the group Jackson's co had wanted to abandon because extracting them was tactically suboptimal. Jackson had been proven right by results. He'd also been reassigned to Outpost Meridian within 48 hours of mission completion. So he'd arrived expecting boredom, isolation, and the kind of routine security duties that kept him employed but not particularly useful. Mountains of paperwork documenting who came and went from a barely staffed facility that most people considered punishment posting. What he absolutely had not expected was being summoned by the Outpost's diplomatic liaison on day 4 and told his first assignment involved spending the night with an alien queen. What exactly does "spend the night" entail? Jackson asked carefully, because that phrasing could mean a lot of different things, and he needed clarity before his brain went places it shouldn't. "Sitting in her presence chamber from sunset to dawn," Chen said, and Jackson felt relief that was probably visible on his face. "No physical contact unless she initiates it, which is unlikely. No weapons or recording devices. They interfere with her empathic senses. You're expected to remain awake, maintain respectful distance, and engage in conversation if she wishes, or sit in silence if she prefers." She pulled up more information, images and text that Jackson tried to focus on while his mind kept circling back to the basic absurdity of this situation. "The Etherians are bioempathic," Chen continued. "During Kelthara, Queen Lashara will sense your emotional state, your intentions, your underlying character. If you harbor hostility, deception, or exploitative intent, she'll know instantly. Most species refuse this ritual because having your inner self examined so thoroughly is profoundly uncomfortable. And if she senses something she doesn't like, the ritual ends immediately, and diplomatic relations are considered impossible. No second chances, no explanations, just permanent rejection. Jackson absorbed this. Has a human ever performed this ritual before? No. Chen's tone suggested this was significant. Humans are generally considered too emotionally volatile, too unpredictable. Our emotions shift rapidly without clear pheromonal or instinctual patterns that other species can easily read. Most Etherian advisors consider us unsuitable for Kelthara because our inner states are too chaotic for reliable evaluation. So, why is she asking for me specifically? That, Chen said, is what you'll have to ask her. If you accept the assignment, do I have a choice? Chen's expression shifted to something that might have been sympathy or might have been the kind of bureaucratic neutrality that preceded delivering bad news. Technically, yes. This isn't a military order, it's a diplomatic request. You can decline. She paused. But I should mention that refusing would likely end any possibility of meaningful Terran-Etherian relations for the foreseeable future. The Queen specifically asked for you, and rejecting that request would be interpreted as profound disrespect. Jackson stared at her. That's absolutely pressure. Yes, but I'm being honest about the stakes. Chen leaned forward. Lieutenant Commander, the Etherian sovereignty controls 7 star systems. They've been neutral in every major conflict for the past century, refusing to ally with any power despite considerable diplomatic pressure. If Queen Lashara is willing to perform Kelthara with a human representative, it suggests she's considering formal alliance with the Terran coalition. She pulled up a star map showing the region around Outpost Meridian, contested space where 4 different powers claimed overlapping territories, where conflicts simmered constantly and occasionally erupted into violence. This region is a powder keg, Chen said. If the Etherians are willing to mediate, if they're willing to partner with us in preventing the next war, it could reshape the entire political landscape. Millions of lives could be affected by whether this alliance happens. And it depends on me spending one night sitting in a room with their queen. It depends on whether you can prove to her satisfaction that humans can be trusted, that we're capable of being reliable partners, that we won't exploit vulnerability, that our unpredictable emotions don't make us fundamentally unsuitable for the kind of cooperation she's considering. Chen's expression was carefully neutral, but Jackson could read the weight behind her words. No pressure, he muttered. Considerable pressure, Chen corrected. But you're the one she asked for, and I don't think that was random. So the question is, will you accept? Jackson thought about 300 refugees who'd made it out of a war zone because he'd refused to abandon them. Thought about being reassigned to a dead-end outpost because doing the right thing had been politically inconvenient. Thought about Queen Lashara, a being he'd never met, specifically requesting him for a ritual that most of his species had never been considered suitable for. Yeah, he said, I'll do it. But I want to know why she chose me before I walk into that room. Chen pulled up a data chip and slid it across the desk. The Queen sent this. Instructions for the ritual, cultural guidelines, and a personal message she wanted you to have before tonight. Jackson loaded the chip into his tablet, scanning through the formal instructions first. Enter at sunset. Maintain 2 meters distance unless invited closer. Avoid sudden movements. Speak honestly if addressed. Remain present until dawn. Then he opened the personal message. Lieutenant Commander Park, I requested you specifically for Kelthara because I observed you during the Outpost opening ceremony last month. While other diplomats performed their roles with practiced precision, you stood at the periphery watching the Etherian delegation with genuine curiosity rather than calculated diplomatic interest. When my chief advisor stumbled on the stairs, you moved to help before remembering protocol and stopping yourself. Your instinct was assistance, not advantage. That momentary reaction, help first, calculate later, suggested character worth examining more closely. I look forward to our conversation. Queen Lashara Jackson read the message 3 times, trying to understand how a moment he barely remembered, seeing someone about to fall and instinctively moving to catch them before his brain caught up with diplomatic protocol, had led to this. She's very observant, Chen said, having read the message over his shoulder. The Etherians value instinctive responses over calculated actions. You showed her something about your character without meaning to, and she wants to confirm whether that glimpse represents your actual nature or just an unusual moment. I literally just saw someone about to fall and reacted. Most diplomats wouldn't. They'd calculate whether intervention was appropriate, consider the political implications, weigh the risk of causing offense by touching someone uninvited. You just moved to help. That's what interested her. Chen checked her chronometer. You have 6 hours until sunset. I suggest you use them to prepare. Read everything you can about Etherian culture, review the ritual guidelines, and try to get some rest. It's going to be a long night. Jackson stood, the data chip feeling heavier than its actual weight. For what it's worth, Chen said as he reached the door, I think she chose well. You're probably one of the only people on this outpost who won't spend the entire night calculating political advantage, instead of just being honest. Is that a compliment or a professional assessment of my complete lack of diplomatic skill? Both, and in this situation, that might be exactly what's needed. Jackson spent the afternoon in his quarters reading everything the database had about Etherian culture, which turned out to be less comprehensive than he'd hoped. The Etherians were intensely private, a species that valued emotional authenticity above almost everything else, and considered superficial social interactions to be fundamentally dishonest. They'd achieved interstellar travel approximately 800 years before humans had, established their current governmental structure 6 centuries ago, and maintained strict neutrality through multiple galactic conflicts that had reshaped the political landscape around them. Their most distinctive feature, beyond the long ears that seemed common to several species in this region, was their chromatophores, specialized cells that shifted color based on emotional and physiological states, creating patterns visible across their skin that other Etherians could read instinctively. The database included detailed charts showing what different colors meant: deep blue for calm assessment, gold for interest or curiosity, purple for empathic engagement, green for approval, red for alarm or anger, gray for uncertainty. But the notes warned that individual patterns were complex and contextual, that Etherians communicated as much through chromatic shifts as through verbal language, and that most other species found reading those patterns extremely difficult without years of training. Queen Lashara herself was something of an enigma. She'd been ruling for 47 years, relatively young for Etherian leadership, which often lasted centuries given their extended lifespans. She'd ascended to power during a period of internal reform, had navigated multiple attempts by other powers to pull the Etherian sovereignty into alliances, and had maintained the rigid neutrality that was apparently core to Etherian philosophy. The database included exactly 3 images of her. One from her coronation ceremony, showing a young Etherian in elaborate robes, her chromatophores displaying patterns the database couldn't quite interpret. One from a diplomatic reception 15 years ago, where she stood among representatives from a dozen species, her expression composed and her chromatophores showing steady blue. And one recent photo from Outpost Meridian's opening ceremony last month, the event where Jackson had apparently caught her attention by almost helping her advisor. In that image, Queen Lashara appeared tall even by Etherian standards, with the kind of bearing that suggested complete self-possession. Her robes were formal but not ostentatious, deep green that complemented her natural coloring. Her chromatophores showed deep blue with hints of gold at the edges. She looked, Jackson thought, like someone who'd spent decades evaluating people and situations, someone whose assessment would be thorough and unforgiving of deception. The entry on Kelthara was frustratingly vague. Traditional Etherian trust evaluation performed during the Queen's vulnerable night cycle. Participants spend sunset to dawn in proximity, while the Queen's empathic abilities assess character and intent. Requires complete honesty and emotional transparency. Failure results in permanent diplomatic rejection. Success establishes foundation for long-term cooperation. What the entry didn't say. What exactly emotional transparency meant in practice, what happened during those hours, how the evaluation actually worked, or why Queen Lashara would choose to perform this ritual with a human she'd never formally met. At 1700 hours, Jackson's door chimed. Commander Chen stood in the corridor, looking like she'd been awake for the past several hours running scenarios about how this night might go wrong. The Queen's staff has prepared the presence chamber, she said. You have 1 hour before sunset. I thought you might want a final briefing. Jackson gestured her inside. I've been reading about Kelthara. The database entries are not very detailed about what actually happens. That's because most species who have experienced it consider the details too personal to document publicly. What I can tell you, from the few accounts that exist, is this. Queen Lashara will be evaluating everything about you. Not just what you say, but how you say it. Not just your conscious thoughts, but your emotional responses. Your baseline character beneath whatever diplomatic masks you might try to wear. Chen sat on the edge of Jackson's desk. She'll sense fear, which is expected and acceptable. She'll sense curiosity, nervousness, uncertainty, all normal. What she's looking for is the foundation beneath those surface emotions. The core values that determine your choices when you're stressed or tired or don't have time to calculate the politically optimal response. And what foundation is she hoping to find? Honesty, integrity, the ability to be trusted with vulnerability without exploiting it. Chen paused. Etherians believe that most species can fake surface emotions. Diplomats do it constantly. But during Kelthara, when someone is stressed and exhausted, when they've been sitting for hours with nowhere to hide, that's when true character emerges. The Queen wants to see who you really are when the diplomatic masks come off. So I should just be myself. That's the strategy. That's the only strategy that works. She'll know if you're performing. She'll sense calculation or deception instantly. Your best chance, probably your only chance, is complete honesty even when it's uncomfortable. Jackson felt his stomach tighten. I'm not sure I'm comfortable having someone examine my inner character that thoroughly. Most beings aren't. That's why so few species accept Kelthara when offered. Chen's expression softened slightly. But the Queen chose you specifically, which suggests she already suspects she'll find something worth trusting. Your job is just to confirm that instinct. She stood, moving toward the door. 30 minutes to sunset. The presence chamber is in the eastern wing, 3rd level. The Queen's attendants will be outside if you need anything. But once the ritual begins, you won't be able to leave until dawn except in case of genuine emergency. Define genuine emergency. Building on fire, medical crisis, imminent attack on the outpost. Not this is uncomfortable, or I need a bathroom break, or I'm having second thoughts. You commit to the full night or you don't start at all. Jackson took a deep breath, trying to calm nerves that felt entirely reasonable given the situation. Any final advice? Don't try to be impressive. Don't calculate what she wants to hear. Just talk to her like she's a person rather than a political entity. Chen smiled slightly. I know that sounds impossibly simple, but I think that's actually what she's looking for, someone who can see past her title and status to the being underneath. Someone who will treat her vulnerability with respect rather than trying to exploit it for advantage. I can do that. I know. That's why I think she chose well. Chen left, and Jackson spent the remaining time trying not to overthink what was about to happen. At 17:45 hours, he left his quarters and headed toward the eastern wing. The presence chamber was nothing like Jackson expected. He'd anticipated something formal and imposing, a throne room designed to emphasize Queen Lashara's authority and status, something that would make him feel small and aware of the power differential. Instead, the chamber was intimate and comfortable. It was circular, perhaps 10 meters in diameter, with walls that appeared to be living wood shaped into elegant curves. The ceiling somehow displayed the actual night sky despite being inside a space station, stars visible through what must have been sophisticated holographic technology or actual transparent sections, positioned to show external space. The furnishings suggested conversation rather than ceremony. Two low couches positioned facing each other across a small table, soft lighting provided by bioluminescent plants growing along the walls, a window showing the station's view of contested space. Queen Lashara was already present, standing near the window, her back to the entrance. Her chromatophores were showing that same deep blue Jackson had seen in the photographs, steady and calm. She turned as he entered, and Jackson got his first real look at her face. Tall, easily 2 meters. Elegant bearing that came from decades of leadership, but without the rigid formality he'd expected. Her robes were simpler than formal court attire, deep green that complemented her natural coloring beautifully. Her ears shifted as she assessed him, a subtle movement that Jackson's limited cultural knowledge couldn't interpret. "Lieutenant Commander Park," she said, and her voice carried melodic tones that the universal translator struggled to render accurately. "Thank you for accepting this ritual. I know it was an unusual request." "Your Majesty." Jackson bowed at what he hoped was the appropriate depth, trying to remember the protocol briefings he'd skimmed through. "I'm honored by your trust, though I'll admit I'm not entirely sure why you chose me. Please sit." She gestured to one of the couches. "We have many hours ahead. Formal titles will become tiresome." Jackson sat carefully on the indicated couch, maintaining the 2-meter distance the instructions had specified. The cushions adjusted to his weight automatically, some kind of adaptive material that made the seating surprisingly comfortable. Queen Lashara settled onto the opposite couch with fluid grace, her chromatophores shifting to include hints of gold that Jackson's afternoon reading suggested meant curious interest. "I chose you," she said, answering his earlier question, "because I believe humanity possesses a quality that most species lack, the ability to make moral choices without relying on rigid instinct or biological imperatives." Jackson blinked. "I'm not sure that's unique to humans. Most species make moral choices. Most species follow behavioral patterns established by evolutionary biology," the Queen corrected gently. "Etherians are intensely empathic. We feel others' emotions as directly as our own and respond, according to complex social instincts that have been refined over millennia. Kethrans have elaborate honor codes essentially written into their genetic memory. Valorians experience emotional states that directly influence their decision-making through pheromonal responses they can't easily override." Her chromatophores shifted toward deeper gold. "Humans are messier. You don't have strong empathic abilities that force you to feel others' pain. You don't have rigid honor codes embedded in your biology. You don't have pheromonal imperatives that determine your emotional responses. You make choices based on something harder to define, conscience, perhaps, or personal ethics that aren't written into your DNA." She leaned forward slightly. "That makes you unpredictable, which most species find profoundly unsettling. But I find it interesting, potentially valuable. Because unpredictable means we might make different choices than other species would. Because unpredictable means you might make moral choices even when your biology suggests you shouldn't. When empathy doesn't force you to care, when honor doesn't compel you to act, when pheromones don't determine your response, and you choose compassion anyway, that's remarkable. The Queen's chromatophores pulsed with bright gold briefly. "Tell me, Lieutenant Commander, when you saw my chief advisor stumble during the opening ceremony, why did you move to help?" Jackson thought back to that moment, which he'd barely registered as significant until reading the Queen's message earlier. "Because someone was about to fall and I was close enough to catch them." That seemed like obvious behavior. "Yet you stopped before actually helping. Why?" "Because I realized mid-movement that I didn't know the protocol for touching a member of your court uninvited. I didn't want to cause offense or create a diplomatic incident by grabbing someone without permission." The Queen's chromatophores flashed brilliant gold for a full second. "Exactly," she said. "In one instant, you experienced instinctive compassion, the immediate desire to help someone in need. Then rational calculation, awareness of social context and potential consequences. Then ethical restraint, choosing not to act because the risk of causing harm outweighed the benefit of preventing a minor fall." She settled back into her couch. 3 different decision-making processes happening in perhaps 2 seconds, none of them driven by biological imperative. You chose to help because you wanted to, then chose not to help because you judged it inappropriate. That complexity, that constant ethical evaluation happening in real time, is what interests me about humanity. You're saying my entire species is morally unpredictable, and that's somehow a positive quality. I'm saying your species has the capacity for moral growth that isn't limited by biological constraints. You can choose to be better than your instincts, worse than your potential, or something entirely unexpected. That flexibility is both dangerous and valuable." The Queen's chromatophores shifted to include deep purple alongside the gold, a combination Jackson's reading suggested meant empathic engagement mixed with curiosity. "Most species can be predicted," she continued. "Their empathic patterns, their honor requirements, their pheromonal responses, these create reliable behavioral frameworks. You can generally anticipate how a Kithran will respond to questions of honor, or how an Etherian will react to emotional distress, or how a Valorian will behave under pheromonal influence. But you can't predict humans the same way. No, which makes you terrible diplomatic partners for species that rely on reading biological signals to establish trust. We can't sense your empathic state because you're not empathic. We can't predict your choices based on honor codes you don't have. We can't read pheromonal responses you don't produce." She gestured at the space between them. "That's why Kelthara is necessary. I need to evaluate you through direct observation rather than biological shortcuts. I need to see how you actually behave when given power over vulnerability, when diplomatic masks become too exhausting to maintain, when your true character emerges through fatigue and stress." Jackson felt the weight of what she was saying. "You're testing whether I'll exploit your vulnerability during this ritual." "The ritual has begun, Lieutenant Commander," the Queen said quietly. "I can feel your emotional state now, curiosity about this strange situation, nervousness about being evaluated so thoroughly, underlying determination not to fail or disappoint, all expected, all honest." She tilted her head slightly, her ears shifting into a new position. "What I'm evaluating is what emerges as the night progresses and exhaustion lowers your defenses. That's when I'll see who you truly are beneath the conscious control. That's when I'll know if humanity can be trusted." Jackson felt exposed in a way he'd never experienced before, not physically vulnerable, but emotionally visible, his inner state being read by someone whose abilities he couldn't fully understand. "What do you feel right now?" he asked because the question seemed important. "Your honesty," she said simply, "and your fear that I'll find something you don't want me to see, also honest. Both are good signs." The Queen settled more comfortably into her couch, her chromatophores showing steady purple with gold undertones. "We have until dawn, Lieutenant Commander. Let's discover what else is true." The first hour passed in conversation that started formally and gradually became more natural as Jackson's nerves settled into something approaching calm acceptance. Queen Lashara asked about his career, not the sanitized version that would go in diplomatic reports, but the actual experience of serving in the Terran military, the frustrations and satisfactions, the moments that had shaped his understanding of what service meant. Jackson found himself being more honest than he'd intended. The evacuation on Kepler 7 was supposed to be straightforward, he said, talking about the incident that had gotten him reassigned. Standard civilian extraction from a conflict zone. My commanding officer had designed a route that minimized risk to our forces. We'd extract the refugees who were already gathered at the primary rally point, leave within our safe operational window, maintain our security margins. But, the Queen prompted, her chromatophores showing steady purple that suggested she was fully engaged in listening. But there were 300 people at a secondary location. Families who'd been delayed by injuries or who couldn't move fast enough to reach the primary rally point. My co's plan categorized them as acceptable losses. We couldn't extract them within the safe window, so we'd leave them behind. Jackson's hands tightened slightly on his knees. He had strategic justifications, valid ones. Staying longer increased risk to everyone. The longer we remained planetside, the higher the chance of hostile engagement that could have gotten the entire evacuation force killed. But you refused to follow the plan. I argued for a modified approach. Riskier, definitely. We'd have to extend our operational window, expose our forces to potential attack, operate outside optimal safety parameters. But it meant everyone got out. And your commanding officer. He ordered me to implement his plan. I refused, told him I'd take full responsibility for the decision, but that I wasn't leaving 300 civilians to die when we had the capacity to save them. Jackson met the Queen's gaze directly. We extracted everyone. All 300 from the secondary location made it onto the evacuation ships. We took fire during the final extraction, came close to taking casualties, but everyone survived. Yet you were punished. I was reassigned to Outpost Meridian for insubordination and refusing lawful orders. Technically, my co was correct. I did violate the chain of command. His plan would have been safer for our forces. I gambled with people's lives by extending the operation beyond safe parameters. The Queen's chromatophores shifted to include soft green alongside the purple, but you'd make the same choice again. Yes, Jackson didn't hesitate. I'd rather be reassigned to a dozen dead-end outposts than live with knowing I abandoned people I could have saved. That certainty, that willingness to accept consequences for moral choices, is what I needed to confirm. Queen Lashara's chromatophores pulsed bright gold briefly. Most beings calculate whether their principles are worth the personal cost. You seem to consider the calculation itself to be beside the point. The 300 people at that secondary location didn't care about my career prospects or my co's strategic concerns. They cared about not being left behind to die. That seemed more important than anything else. And if your modified plan had failed, if people had died because you extended the operation beyond safe limits. Jackson had thought about this question many times during sleepless nights after the evacuation. Then I would have been responsible for those deaths. I would have had to live with knowing my judgment was wrong. But at least I would have tried. I would have used whatever power I had to help rather than accepting that some people were expendable for strategic convenience. The Queen leaned forward, her chromatophores showing complex patterns now, purple and gold and green all swirling together. You understand that most species wouldn't make that choice. That accepting risk to save strangers who have no claim on your loyalty contradicts most evolutionary imperatives. Maybe, but evolution also gave humans the capacity to care about people we've never met, to feel responsible for suffering we didn't cause but have power to prevent. That seems like something worth acting on, even when it costs you, especially when it costs me. If I'm not willing to sacrifice my career for my principles, then they're not really principles. They're just convenient positions I hold when there's no personal price. The Queen's chromatophores flashed brilliant gold, and she made a sound that the translator rendered as satisfied approval. That, she said, is exactly the kind of moral clarity I was hoping to find. Not that you made the right choice. Reasonable beings can disagree about whether your risk assessment was sound, but that you made a genuine ethical decision and accepted the consequences without trying to avoid responsibility. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the contested space visible beyond the station. Most leaders I've dealt with make decisions based on political calculation. What choice will minimize backlash, maximize support, protect their position? They frame those calculations as strategic necessity and convince themselves they're being wise rather than self-serving. Her tone carried weight that suggested personal experience. You made a choice that damaged your career and did it anyway because civilians mattered more than your advancement. That's not strategic wisdom. That's character. Jackson thought about how to respond and settled on honesty. It's also possibly stupidity. My co might have been right that I endangered the entire operation through stubbornness. I might have been lucky that it worked out rather than skillful in my judgment. Perhaps, but you acted according to your values rather than your interests. In my experience, that's rarer than luck or skill. The Queen returned to her seat, and Jackson noticed that her chromatophores were showing more purple now, the gold fading slightly. His reading had suggested that increasing purple meant deeper empathic engagement. She was sensing his emotional state more thoroughly, examining the layers beneath his words. "Tell me about your transfer here," she said. "How did you feel when you learned you were being reassigned to Outpost Meridian?" Jackson considered deflecting, giving a diplomatic answer about viewing it as an opportunity for growth. But the Queen would sense deception, and besides, she'd asked for honesty. "Angry," he admitted. "I saved 300 lives and got punished for it while my co got commended for his strategic planning under pressure. It felt like being told that following orders mattered more than the actual lives we're supposed to protect. But you accepted the transfer. I didn't have much choice. And honestly," Jackson paused, searching for the right words, "part of me was relieved. I'm not good at the political aspects of military service. I'm not good at calculating how my choices will be perceived or how to frame decisions to please superior officers. I just try to do what seems right and deal with consequences later." He gestured at the presence chamber, at the situation he found himself in. That approach doesn't work well in environments where politics matter more than results. So being assigned to a quiet outpost where I wouldn't have to navigate complex hierarchies or make choices that would anger people who outrank me, that actually seemed like it might be easier. "Yet here you sit," the Queen said, her chromatophores showing what might have been amusement, "in the middle of a situation with profound political implications, making choices that will affect interstellar relations, navigating exactly the kind of complexity you hope to avoid." Jackson couldn't help but laugh. "Yeah, apparently the universe has a sense of humor about my career preferences. Or perhaps," the Queen said, her tone gentle, "you were sent here because someone recognized that you're exactly the kind of human this situation requires. Someone who won't calculate political advantage, who will treat this ritual as what it is, an evaluation of character, rather than an opportunity to manipulate an ally." She tilted her head, studying him. "Has it occurred to you that your reassignment might not have been punishment but placement? That someone in your command structure recognized you were wasted in positions that required political skill you don't possess, and would be valuable in situations requiring moral clarity you have in abundance?" Jackson hadn't considered that possibility. "You think someone deliberately sent me here knowing you might request Kelthara? I think someone sent you here knowing that if significant diplomatic opportunities arose, you'd handle them honestly rather than strategically. And given that the Etherian sovereignty values honesty above strategy, you might be the best possible human for this posting." The Queen's chromatophores shifted to include more gold again. Your commanding officer might have done you a favor by reassigning you, even if it felt like punishment. Sometimes being removed from situations where you don't fit well is kindness rather than rejection. Jackson sat with that thought, turning it over in his mind. The possibility that his reassignment had been recognition of his strengths rather than punishment for his failures. It was almost harder to accept than the version where he'd been exiled for insubordination. "I'm not sure I believe that," he said finally, "but I appreciate the perspective. Belief isn't required, just consideration." The Queen settled back into her couch. "We have many hours remaining. Tell me about Earth, not the diplomatic briefing version, but what you actually think about your homeworld. What you value about human culture, what frustrates you, what gives you hope." And Jackson found himself talking, really talking, not performing or calculating, but just sharing his actual thoughts about humanity, about Earth, about the constant tension between what humans aspired to be and what they actually were. He talked about human history, the cycles of violence and progress, the way every generation seemed to repeat the mistakes of previous ones, while somehow also building something slightly better. About art and music that tried to capture meaning in a universe that didn't come with inherent purpose. About the stubborn, human refusal to accept that things couldn't be improved, even when improvement seemed impossible. "We're a mess," he admitted as the second hour passed into the third. "Humans, I mean. We can't agree on basic moral principles. What one culture considers sacred, another considers negotiable. We've gone to war over ideas, over resources, over insults, over land neither side could actually use. We're violent and inconsistent, and we keep making the same mistakes across centuries." "And yet," the Queen prompted, because her tone suggested she heard the unspoken qualification. "And yet we keep trying. We don't give up on the idea that we can be better than we are. We build ethical systems, tear them down when they don't work, build new ones. We argue endlessly about what's right instead of accepting that our nature is fixed. We create art about our failures because examining those failures matters to us." Jackson met her gaze. That persistence in the face of constant failure, that refusal to accept that we're as good as we're going to get, that's maybe the most human thing about us. We're terrible at actually being good, but we're excellent at refusing to give up on the attempt. The Queen's chromatophores had shifted to show pure gold now, bright and sustained. That quality, that refusal to accept moral stagnation, is exactly what makes humanity interesting to me. Most species reach equilibrium. They find behavioral patterns that work and maintain them across millennia. She gestured at herself. Etherians have been essentially unchanged for thousands of years. Our empathic abilities created stable social structures that we've never had reason to alter significantly. Our values are ancient because they work, and working systems are maintained rather than questioned. But humans never reach that equilibrium. No, you keep changing, keep questioning, keep trying to be better than you were. Sometimes you succeed, sometimes you fail catastrophically, but you never settle for good enough. That's exhausting and chaotic and beautiful. The Queen's tone softened. "I can feel your exhaustion now, Lieutenant Commander. We're passing into the deeper hours of night. Your defenses are lowering, the diplomatic mask is slipping away. You're too tired to calculate optimal responses. Is that bad? No, that's when I see truth. That's when character emerges without conscious control." She leaned forward slightly. "And what I'm sensing beneath your exhaustion is contentment. You're uncomfortable with this ritual, uncertain about where tonight leads, worried about failing. But underneath all of that, you're content to be here. You find this conversation meaningful in a way that most of your work isn't. You value genuine connection over political positioning." Her chromatophores pulsed gold. "I've performed Kelthara 17 times with representatives from different species. Most spend the entire night calculating how to present themselves favorably, how to hide their true nature, how to use this ritual for advantage. You're just talking, being honest, not trying to win anything. Should I be trying to win something? No, the Queen's smile was warm. That's exactly why this is working. The fourth hour brought a shift in the conversation that Jackson didn't expect. Queen Lashara stood and moved to the window, and for the first time since the ritual began, her chromatophores showed something other than gold or purple, deep blue with undertones of what might have been gray. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, looking out at the contested space beyond the station. "That will make sense of why I requested Kelthara with you. Why I'm evaluating whether humanity can be trusted with significant partnership." She turned to face him, and her expression was more serious than it had been all night. "This region, the contested zone we're positioned in, is about to become a flashpoint. Within 6 months, possibly sooner, multiple powers will converge here with competing territorial claims and strategic interests. Without a neutral mediating force, war is almost inevitable." Jackson felt his exhaustion recede slightly as his mind engaged with what she was saying, and the Etherian sovereignty could serve that mediating role. "We're trusted as neutral. We have no territorial ambitions in this region. Our empathic abilities make us effective at understanding different perspectives and finding compromise." The Queen's chromatophores shifted darker, "But we can't do it alone. We need a partner species, someone who can provide what Etherians lack: military force, moral flexibility." The Queen's tone was frank. "Etherians struggle with moral ambiguity. Our empathic nature means we feel others' pain directly, which makes us excellent at understanding perspectives, but terrible at making hard choices that harm anyone. We become paralyzed trying to find solutions that satisfy everyone's emotional needs." She moved back toward her couch, her chromatophores showing complex patterns of blue and purple and hints of gold. "In mediation, sometimes you must make decisions that hurt some parties to benefit others. Sometimes you must impose solutions that no one wants because the alternative is worse. Sometimes you must choose the lesser harm when no good options exist. And Etherians can't do that because you feel the harm too directly. Yes, when I impose a decision that causes suffering, I feel that suffering as directly as my own pain. It makes ruthless pragmatism nearly impossible. I'm biologically inclined toward solutions that minimize everyone's distress, rather than solutions that might cause short-term harm for long-term stability." The Queen sat down, and her chromatophores settled into steady purple. "Humans don't have that limitation. You can feel empathy without being overwhelmed by it. You can make difficult choices that harm some to help others without losing your ethical center. You can be ruthless when necessary and compassionate when possible, and you maintain moral clarity through that contradiction." Jackson processed this. "You want humanity to partner with the Etherian sovereignty in mediating this region. Etherians provide empathic understanding and neutral positioning. Humans provide the willingness to make hard choices. More than that, I'm considering recommending formal alliance to my council, the first formal alliance the Etherian sovereignty has entered in more than a century. That's enormous. That's betting my people's future on humanity's capacity for moral restraint despite having power we don't possess." She looked at him directly. "So I'm evaluating you, Lieutenant Commander. Not as a diplomat or a military officer, but as an example of whether humans can be trusted with the kind of power that partnership would grant. If you can sit through this night with me, knowing I'm vulnerable, that you could exploit this situation, that I'm offering significant power through alliance, and choose to simply be trustworthy, then perhaps your species deserves the trust I'm considering giving." The weight of what she was saying settled heavily on Jackson's already tired shoulders. That's a lot to extrapolate from one person's behavior during one ritual. "It is," the Queen acknowledged, "but Kelthara has never failed me. When defenses are down, when exhaustion removes the ability to maintain facades, true character emerges. I'm seeing yours now. Honest, principled, uncomfortable with power but willing to accept responsibility when necessary. Flawed and aware of those flaws, determined to be better than expedience would require. Her chromatophores pulsed brilliant gold. You're proving exactly what I hoped to find. Not perfection. I don't trust perfection because it's always performance, but genuine integrity. The kind of character that makes hard choices and accepts consequences without trying to justify or evade them. Jackson didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing for a moment, just sat with the magnitude of what she was proposing. "If you recommend alliance," he said finally, "if your council accepts and the Terran coalition agrees, I'm assuming this means I'm not going back to quiet routine security duties. You'll be primary liaison if alliance proceeds. Not because you're the most experienced diplomat, you're clearly not, but because you've demonstrated the character necessary for the role. Someone who won't exploit our vulnerabilities, who will make ethical choices even when difficult, who values genuine cooperation over political advantage. I'm not qualified for that level of responsibility. You're qualified because you don't want the power but will use it responsibly anyway. That's exactly the kind of human I need representing your species in this partnership." The Queen's chromatophores shifted to show more blue alongside the purple and gold. "And because you understand something that many diplomats don't, that trust is built through honesty rather than manipulation. That the foundation of cooperation is mutual respect rather than calculated advantage. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is choose not to use the power you have." She gestured at the space between them. "You've been sitting here for hours knowing that I'm vulnerable during Kelthara, that my defenses are lowered, my empathic senses heightened, my position inherently exposed. You have power in this situation, power to betray my trust, to gather information you could use against me, to exploit my openness for advantage. I would never. I know, that's what I'm confirming." The Queen's tone was gentle. "You don't even see the power you have because you're not looking for ways to exploit vulnerability. You're just having a conversation, treating me as a person rather than a political opportunity. That restraint, that fundamental decency, is what makes you trustworthy." Jackson felt the truth of what she was saying settle into his exhausted mind. He hadn't been calculating during this conversation, hadn't been looking for advantages or trying to gather intelligence or positioning himself for political benefit. He'd just been talking to Queen Lashara as if she was someone interesting rather than someone important. "Is that really so unusual?" he asked. "Just treating someone like a person? In these contexts, yes, extremely unusual." The Queen's chromatophores showed patterns that might have been sadness. Most beings who achieve positions of power stop seeing others as people and start seeing them as pieces in political games. Allies or threats, assets or obstacles, means to ends rather than ends in themselves. She stood and moved to the window again, and Jackson noticed for the first time that the sky visible through the ceiling was beginning to show hints of pre-dawn light, still dark, but no longer the deep black of full night. "I'm isolated," the Queen said quietly. "Not physically. I have advisors, staff, people who attend to my needs, but genuinely isolated. When you're an empathic being who constantly feels others' emotions, you become very aware of when people are performing rather than being authentic. Most interactions I have are performances. Diplomatic courtesies, political maneuvering, strategic conversations where everyone is calculating advantages." Her chromatophores shifted to show more blue than gold now. "This night, this conversation, has been the first genuine interaction I've had in longer than I care to admit. You're not performing for me, not trying to impress me or manipulate me or gather intelligence. You're just being honest because that's apparently how you approach everything." She turned to face him. "That honesty is valuable beyond any political advantage. If we do form alliance, if humanity and the Etherian sovereignty work together to mediate this region, I'll need someone I can trust to tell me truth instead of what I want to hear. someone who values genuine cooperation over political positioning. And you think I'm that person based on one night of conversation. I think you're that person based on what I'm sensing beneath the conversation. Your emotional state, your underlying values, the character that emerges when you're too exhausted to maintain careful control. The Queen's chromatophores pulsed gold again. Kelthara doesn't fail, Lieutenant Commander. It shows me who people really are, and you're someone worth trusting. The conversation continued as dawn approached, topics flowing from philosophy to practical concerns about what alliance would actually mean, what challenges they'd face, what hopes they had for preventing the conflict everyone seemed to think was inevitable. Jackson found himself speaking about things he'd never articulated before. His frustrations with systems that valued procedure over outcomes. His belief that individual choices mattered even when institutions failed. His hope that maybe cooperation was possible if enough people chose it instead of waiting for perfect conditions. And Queen Lashara shared in return, speaking about the isolation of empathic leadership, the burden of feeling her people's emotions while needing to maintain clarity for decision-making, the difficulty of navigating a galaxy where most species didn't understand what it meant to feel others' pain as directly as your own. We're both outsiders in different ways, she said as the pre-dawn light grew stronger. You're unpredictable in a galaxy that values behavioral consistency. I'm empathic in a political landscape that rewards emotional distance. Perhaps that's why Kelthara worked. We both understand what it means to not quite fit the roles others expect. Jackson checked his chronometer, 6:18 hours. Sunrise was scheduled for 6:30, 12 minutes away. Did I pass? He asked, too tired to filter the bluntness. The Queen's chromatophores flashed with what might have been amusement, quick pulses of bright gold. Is that how you think of this? A test to pass or fail? I'm too exhausted to think of it as anything except a very long night that's almost over. Queen Lashara laughed, a genuine sound that her translator rendered as melodic chimes that somehow conveyed warmth. Perfect answer, she said. No, you didn't pass a test. You proved something more important, that humans can be trusted to choose integrity over advantage even when exhausted, vulnerable, and offered power. That's what I needed to know. The first rays of actual dawn began filtering through the window. The station's position relative to the local star had shifted enough that natural light was now visible. Queen Lashara stood, and Jackson rose as well, his muscles protesting the long night of sitting. Her chromatophores were showing pure gold now, bright and sustained, the clearest expression of approval he'd seen all night. I will recommend to my council that we pursue formal alliance with the Terran coalition, she said, her tone carrying ceremonial weight, with the condition that you serve as primary liaison. Not because you're the most experienced diplomat, but because you've demonstrated the character necessary for partnership. Someone who won't exploit our vulnerabilities and who will make ethical choices even when difficult. Your Majesty, I'm not sure I'm qualified for that level of. You're qualified because you don't want the power but will use it responsibly anyway. The Queen's tone was gentle but firm. That's exactly what I need. Someone who values genuine cooperation over political advancement, who will tell me truth instead of what I want to hear, who treats alliance as genuine partnership rather than strategic advantage. The chamber doors opened. Dawn had arrived. The ritual was formally complete. Attendants entered, their expressions carefully neutral but their own chromatophores showing patterns that suggested they'd been anxiously waiting all night. Queen Lashara extended her hand in the human gesture of partnership, and Jackson shook it, feeling the significance of that simple contact. Welcome to the most important assignment of your career, Lieutenant Commander, she said. And thank you for a night of honest conversation. It's rarer than you might think, even among those who claim to value truth. As Jackson left the presence chamber, exhausted and uncertain about what he just committed to, Commander Chen was waiting in the corridor outside. She looked like she'd been awake all night as well, her expression cycling between relief and anxiety. "How did it go?" she asked as soon as the chamber doors closed behind him. Jackson tried to find words that would adequately summarize the past 12 hours and came up empty. "I think I just accidentally became the primary liaison for a formal alliance between humanity and the Etherian sovereignty," he said finally. "Also, I'm exhausted and nothing makes sense anymore, and I need approximately 12 hours of sleep before I can process any of this." Chen's expression shifted to something between pride and concern. "She chose you for the alliance liaison position. Apparently, my complete lack of political calculation is exactly what she's looking for in a diplomatic partner." Jackson rubbed his face, trying to focus through the exhaustion. "She said Kelthara showed her I'm trustworthy, that I value integrity over advantage, that I treat people as people instead of political opportunities." "And are you," Chen asked, "all of those things?" "I have no idea. I'm too tired to evaluate my own character right now." Jackson started walking toward his quarters, Chen falling into step beside him. "But apparently the Queen thinks I am, and she's betting a formal alliance on that assessment, so I guess I'd better live up to it." "For what it's worth," Chen said, "I think she chose well. You're probably one of the only people who could have sat through that night without trying to manipulate the situation for advantage. Most diplomats would have seen it as an opportunity to gather intelligence or build leverage or establish dominance. You just treated it as a conversation. Because that's what it was. A conversation with someone interesting who happened to be evaluating my character through empathic abilities I don't fully understand." They reached Jackson's quarters and he palmed the door open, desperate for sleep. "Get some rest," Chen said. "We'll debrief fully once you've recovered." "But Jackson," she paused, "this is huge. If the Etherian sovereignty formally allies with us, if we can mediate this region together, we might actually prevent the next war. Millions of lives could be affected by what happened in that chamber tonight." "No pressure," Jackson muttered. "Enormous pressure," Chen corrected with a slight smile. "But you apparently handle pressure well when you're too tired to calculate optimal responses. So maybe exhaustion is your secret weapon." She left, and Jackson collapsed onto his bed without bothering to remove his uniform. His last thought before sleep took him was that he'd come to Outpost Meridian expecting quiet routine and career stagnation. Instead, he'd spent the night being evaluated by an alien queen who decided to trust humanity based on his inability to be politically calculating. He'd been chosen not despite his flaws but because of them, because his complete lack of diplomatic skill meant he treated people honestly instead of strategically. And now, he was apparently going to represent his entire species in a formal alliance that might determine whether millions of people lived in peace or died in the next war. The universe, Jackson thought as consciousness faded, had a really strange sense of humor about his career trajectory. But Queen Lashara had been right about one thing. The night of conversation had been meaningful in a way that most of his work never was. He'd been seen, really seen, his character